The doors opened without your approval while you overlooked the city of Musatafi from your lofty penthouse. Though lavish with couture furniture, you were a prisoner in this paradise, clutching your hands on the silk robe that draped across your shoulders. The steps that clicked against the timber floors were familiar, in time and rhythm, until you felt a large hand encircle past your neck and gripping onto your shoulder. You attempted to ignore his warm touch despite the firm grip he possessed, feeling his body edge closer and his quiet breath by your ear.
"How are you, my darling?"
whispered Todoroki, his somber voice sending shivers down your spine. All you did was breathe. A sharp exhale escaped your lips involuntarily, louder than you anticipated. You continued to look towards the horizon ahead, staring at that line that curved the dying sunlight into the coming night.
"How do you feel about some fresh air?"
breathed Todoroki in your ear.
"I'm meeting Midoriya for some business. He'd appreciate seeing you well."
The thought brought some disgust, knowing of Midoriya's operations outside in his little world. The inner workings of how cruel this city had turned did not escape your observations, with all of the escape attempts you failed. "Maybe another time?" you questioned, finally uttering words in his presence before you turned towards his cold gaze. Shoto Todoroki was a complex man, aloof in his approach, but behind his cold front burned a smoldering fire that would incinerate any who dared speak one word against his very breath. Others would view you as one of the rare lucky enough to still be alive in his presence, yet you felt differently about those blind observations. You knew better of his wants, his needs, and his undying, unwavering hold that seized you in this glass prison. That cold gaze of his suddenly turned with a smile that crept on his lips. His hands gripped on you warmly with that hold, careful not to break the very skin he trailed his fingers on.
"I'll be needing a confidant this time around,"
he explained coolly.
"I think it's best if you understood the business a little closely."
You stared at him quizzically, mulling on his words while he released you, but not before he squeezed you with a touch that simmered slightly across your skin. You felt that sting, but not enough to leave a mark. It was his way of keeping his presence everlasting moments after he left you to yourself, usually leaving you be. Yet he still stood next to you, his body close while he stared at the horizon ahead, now with the dying light disappearing, crawling into the dark.
"You are so fervent to see the city outside of these walls. Maybe it's time to acquaint yourself with what I see,"
he explained, his eyes back on you while they glimmered with the last of the light. His hair draped along his shoulders, cascading atop his suit while his scar glowed with tiny embers, searing red hot upon his skin. These twilight hours revealed his true nature, his rage, and his pain. And he never revealed this monstrous appearance unless you were witness to it. You had no say any further on tonight's activities after Todoroki left you and demanded that you change into something warm. Wanting to avoid an unnecessary trepidation from a week ago, you did as you were told, and soon met up with Todoroki by the foyer of his agency, now empty of life. All of his underground rendezvous were after hours for this very reason, under the cloak of night, where the only risk was a common witness who would think otherwise of the situation. Todoroki still being a top pro hero in public was the ruse, but shrouded in villainy all the same. The drive in a luxury car was quiet, sitting closer to the door rather than bridging the space in between. Still, he reached out to grab hold of your hand, tender in his touch before he raised your palm to his lips. That warmth of his, no matter how gentle or light his touch burned your skin. He always left an impression. It was a need of his. The street lights decorated the streets, whizzing past him in a daze while his eyes still held on you. There was a power in them that you knew, one that he harnessed but eerily withheld from the public. All he did was stare deep into your eyes while you drowned in his pools of blue and silver. You broke his gaze but kept your hand in his, leaving him to keep his touch on you to stave off the fire he was willing to stoke. The car soon reached a block, one familiar to your eye with its rows of white apartment complexes. Each one was the same as the last, identical in their build, but that was all they were, at least to the unknowing public. You stared up at the block, spotting no windows except for those that were tiny for the bathrooms of each apartment. And only doors.
Stay close to me, darling. Midoriya is still as touchy as ever,
warned Todoroki while he pulled you into his embrace, with his arms resting around your waist and his hand trailing your sides. It was hypocritical for him to state this, you thought, feeling his hands on you tantalizingly moving between his sides and the square of your back. He was nothing but touchy himself, all night, while you walked alongside him towards the large block, entering into the empty courtyard before the click of shoes caught your ear ahead.
Todoroki! So nice to see you,
cooed a low voice with a hint of cheekiness in his tone. There stood Midoriya, smart in his suit with the sound of his keys clinging by his sides with every step he took. You eyed the set by his belt, spotting only 3 at best. All of them were skeleton keys, 1 per complex building. You recalled that arrangement years ago.
The sentiment is mutual,
responded Todoroki in kind, his tone almost devoid of life upon greeting the green-haired man.
Of course, but I'm so glad you squeezed me into your busy day.
That smile of Midoriya's was eerier than you last recalled. He was a screw loose, but he looked more elated with that jump in his step. You figured that something, or someone, had given him a little happiness in his twisted perspective.
And so nice to see you again. It must be so hard for Todoroki to keep you to himself.
He teased with his eyes on you, glowing menacingly in the fluorescent light that flickered above. That smile still on his face, that was a shadow of what he used to be.
You know, your quirk has always fascinated me,
he continued, edging closer with his gloved hand stretching out towards you, his fingers open as if he were a child reaching for candy.
If only I could.
A rough pull of your body clutched into Todoroki's side, his hand immediately pulling you into him while the other grabbed Midoriya's wrist, his grip clawing into his skin. Both men stared at one another, Todoroki more so glaring with a rage, his scar glowing embers once more under the artificial lights. Midoriya replied in turn with sparks of green violent energy bouncing from his body and mingling with the fire that stoked from Todoroki's eyes. You watched their hands, finding that ice began to engulf Midoriya's wrist, threatening to shoot into his flesh before he violently pulled away, stepping back from Todoroki's warning shots. A moment passed between the men until that smile returned on Midoriya's lips, unperturbed by the threat Todoroki had instilled.
Follow me,
chuckled Midoriya, turning heel and leading the both of you away towards the apartment foyer. You felt Todoroki's hand return to the square of your back, but now forced you in place next to him. Midoriya was a threat, but with the quirk you displayed, he was always intrigued to have someone like you to add to his collection. The closest he would ever have was whenever Todoroki would invite you on these visits, which was rare.
I thought Midoriya already paid this quarter,
you remarked, quietly away from earshot from the man that owned this domain.
He did, but he also needs to show me how he is spending my resources,
reminded Todoroki nonchalantly.
They play with the toys, but they're still my toys. Everything comes back to me.
His hand clutched onto your sides again, that possessiveness overpowering with every move he made.
Has Bakugo fulfilled his agreement?
You continued, your eyes elsewhere to avoid that flutter in your stomach.
Yes, as did Kaminari, Zero, and our good doctor.
And Ida?
There was a pause. A momentary lapse of silence that caused your curious eye to turn back onto Todoroki. He stared at you with a suspicious gaze, those aloof eyes eerily calm.
You know more than I anticipated,
he slowly remarked with a curdle in his voice. That shiver returned crawling up your spine, only amplified by his hand that followed after, his fingers trailing up the back of your neck before they rested on the crook of it. You exhaled loudly once more, the reaction bringing a smile to his face.
I'm still waiting, but he is a busy man,
continued Todoroki. Whether your breath threw him off suspicion or made him eager was a double-edged sword. You couldn't escape his grasp, feeling his fingers play with your skin against your neck before they trailed back to your waist. The echoes of your shoes reverberated in the empty foyer before you found that Midoriya was not alone. He reached another who stood silently in the center of the room by the only water feature, his shoulders sturdy while he stood tall. Those golden eyes turned on to you, recognizing you immediately while yours widened a little, hoping you had not given away any indication of your realization to Todoroki beside you.
I would like to introduce you to my confidant,
welcomed Midoriya with a flourish of his hands.
Who is this?
Asked Todoroki, his eyes looking the man up and down with that suspicion again.
A good Samaritan.
The man only smiled, looking Todoroki in the eye with not a flinch or a care for that matter. You watched as he ignored you, taking a step on approach with an open palm.
It is nice to meet you, Todoroki. My name is Seek.
His hand still held in between until after a short moment of suspicion, Todoroki took it in his, feeling Seek's hearty grip.
He just returned from Kachan's barracks and brought back a few good ones to make a home here in my dollhouses.
Interrupted Midoriya, his smile ecstatic on the news he shared.
So you've resorted to stealing,
commented Todoroki, his eyes still on Seek before he released his hand from the shake.
It's not stealing if they're broken goods, and removing the middleman would make for a faster transaction,
explained Midoriya before he quickly turned to Seek, still with that grin.
You'd probably have to pass that along to Kaminari, though.
What are you?
Spat Todoroki, his disdain clear in the tone in his voice.
I'm a collector of souls, except I won't be here for long. My work requires me to travel,
explained Seek.
Then where are you off to? Somewhere across the sea. It was nice to meet you, even if it was brief.
You swore that he turned his eyes on you for a moment, with a glimpse of remorse. With what he had said, you felt it strongly in his gaze. He wasn't coming back. Seek immediately turned to bid Midoriya farewell with a nod before bowing slightly in respect towards Todoroki. He trekked past, but not without a quick glance towards you, his expression unmoving while his cloak billowed beside him. His footsteps soon diminished as he exited from the glass doors, leaving the three of you behind and disappearing into the night.
"Send me a postcard!"
yelled Midoriya after him, despite the man no longer being in earshot. He chuckled under his breath before spotting that growing suspicion from Todoroki, a little unnerved by the presence of an outsider within the company and business he kept.
"Don't worry, Todoroki. He's not even on the system. Had to ask Ida for that kind of information,"
reassured Midoriya.
"Now, you know where to find me to discuss details. I'll leave you to do what you need to do."
The green-haired man hopped away towards the elevators, leaving Todoroki and you behind, while he twirled to wave goodbye. That glint in his eye caught your gaze, almost mesmerizing with that knowing tell before the doors shut, leaving the foyer with you in Todoroki's arms. Todoroki's grip caught you unaware as soon as he pulled you into him, his other fingers gently pulling your jaw to lift your eyes. His face hovered above yours, noses almost grazing until you saw a flicker in his eye.
"You know him?"
he accused, his hands locking you in place with no release.
What?
"That man. You know him, don't you?"
I don't.
You answered, hoping the plea wasn't laced in your voice.
"Who is he, darling?"
Those burning, glowing embers returned along his scar, his heat threatening to lick against your skin. He was aware you were an awful liar, and you cursed yourself for it. In his embrace with his arm pulling you into his body, his fire grew hotter the longer the silence played. There was no reprieve from the heat while his face kneed yours, threatening a searing kiss.
He helped me one time, that's all. I don't know him more than that.
You explained. It was a half-truth, enough for him to ease off from the growing heat and for your body to feel the relief in his hold. Still, it did not cool those fiery embers from his scar, the heat soon flaring into a fire that burned menacingly from. It all happened quickly, making quick work with your hands and halting Todoroki's fiery rage. He halted his advance in his embrace, feeling the sharp point of a piece of ice pressing against the skin under his chin. His cold glare through the fire stared at you, shivering in his arms while you threatened him with a makeshift icicle in your numb hands. Your breath condensed in the air in between, brushing against Todoroki's neck that almost tickled him, despite the heat. Through the shiver, you saw a smile creep back onto his lips, almost chuckling at the sight.
"There's the darling I remember,"
he cooed genially while he staved the fire that engulfed his scar. For a moment you wished he still burned for that heat to keep you from the growing cold that crawled up your arms. But the ice shard soon melted back into water, drenching your hands and stinging them from the cold. You couldn't avoid being drenched yourself with the water pouring between Todoroki and your clothes, while his body still pressed against yours.
"Let me warm you up,"
he teased while his body heat did exactly that, holding his large left hand around both of yours. Your palms pricked from the slow heating, stinging like needles while Todoroki maneuvered to give you a kiss, his lips distracting you from his hands that still entrapped you in his embrace. He glided across the room, moving you towards one of the walls and kept you trapped in between, unable to repeat your stunt once more while he ensured you kept warm by any means necessary. Todoroki released you with a deep breath, allowing you to breathe from his forwardness, overwhelmed by him while he pinned you against the cold walls. His eyes took in the sight of you, pained and yet relieved while you balled your hands into fists. keeping as much heat within holding any suggestion to the pain until his hands brushed through your hair, holding his grip by your side.
You still owe me, darling.
He reminded with a low growl.
And I love you for it.
There was love, but a twisted one, fueled by rage, vengeance, passion, and sadness, and Todoroki wanted nothing more but to keep you. Now with that fleeting look in Seek's eyes, you were left alone to your devices. No more do-overs.
May I still sit in this meeting?
You asked, placidly gazing into Todoroki's eyes, being met by that smile now tainted by the years of rage.
Of course. I'm not going to let you wander alone.
He whispered slowly before a flare of heat seared into the air, drying off the wet clothes from himself and you.
Remember to stay close.
You followed his every move despite his hand still resting by the square of your back, following his every command while you both entered into the elevator. But within his small world, your mind traveled elsewhere, contemplating on the options left now that the time had come. Running away was no longer a viable option, but neither was a direct assault, reflecting on your knee-jerk reaction moments earlier. Perhaps it was time to pay your dues.
Let me stay by your side, Shoto.
You murmured while your eyes stared ahead towards the closed elevator doors. You almost held your breath wondering what Todoroki was doing, yet you were unperturbed by your actions, soon feeling his fingers tenderly grip onto your waist.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
He replied before the doors opened before you.